In part 3 of War No More, we leave off with Grandpa Mitchell still in Fort Fannin, Texas. So, let's get started, shall we? It says, so honey, I'm really serious. If you really think you'll enjoy a trip down here, I'm all for it. I'm just giving you the facts to save you from any unexpected unpleasantness at a time when I know you should be as comfortable and at much as ease as possible under the circumstances over which neither of us have any control. So honestly, honey, think it over and write me just what you would really prefer to do. You know that I'll look to spend as much time as possible with you, both now and after this mess is all over. Deciding whether she should come visit, being that she's carrying a child, which would be my mother. April 4th. This is the first time my grandpa arrives at Fort George G. Meade in Maryland. And the letter this is actually his 176th day in, although it's the first day at Meade. After stopping over in Washington for a couple hours this morning, we arrived on schedule, that is before 12 noon, at Fort George G. Meade, Maryland. Since then, we've been giving our barracks, bags, etc. all over the place in a sort of miniature version of the processing we went through at Camp Grant almost 6 months ago. Upon arrival, we stood in line for a full hour for chow, then had our food dished up to us by German POWs, prisoners of war, in America in 1944. I didn't know that. They seem to have many more of them here than at Fannin, and in addition to the main mess hall, they are employed at numerous jobs throughout camp, including the PXs and service clubs. Whenever they work, signs are prominently displayed, informing the soldiers that POWs are not to be spoken to only in line of duty. Those who I have seen so far appear much more downcast, less healthy, older, and on the whole, much less Superman than those at Grant or Fannin. However, we are now settled in our new, though temporary home, and of course I have no idea at this writing just how short or long our stay will be here. April 6th, there's a cute letter where my grandpa sends a list of baby names back home to my grandma to check out and see if she approves. And, you know, the life chart in back of me here, the way this all started was I found all the little V-mails where he professed his love for this child, whether it be male, female, and even in this letter, when he gives us suggestions, he puts the girls' list first and then the boys. So I'm going to read you the girls' list of names. Phyllis, Hazel, Diane, Ramona, Harriet, and Norma. Now the boys' names are Richard, Kermit, Ronald, Raymond, Harold, and Norman. Wow. I named my first dog Norman. That's the first time I've tagged Spirit on that. So as I go through these things, of course, there's even exciting surprises for me. It says just ideas, not necessarily in the order named. Now what do you think? Funny thing is, you know my mother's name is Barbara. I'm going to go ahead and read page 11. In keeping with my established Army practice, I spent Easter Sunday on KP duty. We have company rather than battalion mess here. That means 200 rather than 1,000 men eat in one mess hall. We also American or family. Oh, we also eat American or family style rather than cafeteria style at Fannin. They use only 6 KPs and 6 table waiters in one day rather than the 40 to 50 at Fannin. They also use old-fashioned cool ranges and a soft coal instead of natural gas at Fannin. The kitchen here is not nearly as clean, and it looks more like it appeared in 1917 at Fort Leonard Wood. What a trip. So, that's the last letter before my grandpa gets sent overseas and out of the United States. And I'm sure that my grandmother's heart just broke because neither of them really believed that he would be forced to go to war and fight on account of his age. So by May 10th, he is still somewhere in North Africa. And he says, however, I am here now, so let's go on from there. The landscape, climate, etc. are not much different than some parts of southern United States. From that point on, any similarity is purely coincidental. The food here is not bad, and we usually get as much as we want. Water, both for drinking and washing, bathing, etc., is much more of a problem than food, but the Army does not. No, the Army does make every possible connection, and though we have none to waste, there seems always to be enough to go around. This is much more fertile country than I had always imagined. Citrus fruits and some vegetables grow in abundance, and especially at this time of the year. The countryside is beautiful. The natives are picturesque, and they have outdone the Army in the matter of water supply. They don't just use it. A good-sized town, which figured very prominently in earlier war news, is not far from camp. I've had a brief look at it, but I hope to be able to do it a bit more thoroughly before we leave this vicinity. From the look of things, we'll be here a short while. Okay, now, by May 25th, 1944, my grandfather is in Lake Messina, Italy, which is 10 miles from the Austrian border, near Dobriaco, Italy, Linz, Austria. So he's in a little resort town, and he really didn't feel he was very diplomatic, that he could not speak German, and very few of them speak any English, and what little conversation that he has carried on with any of them is mutually poco Italiano. However, though many of them are still armed, and they all in those parts have as much or more freedom or movement as we GIs, no real friction occurs now between us and the German troops, who are technically thought not physically our prisoners. The German troops, on the whole, are happy to settle for American chow and cigarettes, of which they get exactly the same rations as we do. There are several good reasons for allowing the German soldiers to be permitted to walk about still armed. In the first place, the job of merely collecting their weapons is a colossal one, a job for which American transport facilities to haul both weapons and prisoners to the rear is just not adequate. Then, too, it appears much safer for all concerned to permit the Germans to keep their arms in view of the irresponsible cowboy spirits of the heavily armed Italian Parisians, or partisans. Ever since the German surrender here in Italy, the partigiari had been strutting about, armed to the teeth with every conceivable kind of weapon, including grenades hanging from their belts like oversized watch fobs. Never until now have I appreciated soldier discipline, which the Germans possessed to the ninth degree, until I had a chance to observe the contrast between their behavior and that of the partisans. If I had my choice between walking alone and unarmed through a town full of armed German soldiers who had given their word of nonviolence, or a town containing only a handful of armed Italian bandits who had individually signed such a pledge, I'll gladly put my fate in the hands of the German soldiers. That's nice. Only last night in a town we had just left, a pitched battle between armed Italians and GIs resulted in at least 8 deaths because the Italians were insisting on redeeming the virtue of a few prostitutes who had consorted for cash, and willingly, with Italians, Germans, and Americans alike. That was dicey. Okay. So, the last paragraph on May 25th says, "Did I tell you in my last letter that I had visited the hotel that borders where Leon Blum, Schuschnigg, Niemöller, et al. Were taken? Is thoroughly modern and comfortable, almost luxurious, but at the dead end of a deep ravine, entirely surrounded by towering mountain peaks, with an apparently bottomless lake just under the window of most of the guest rooms. A thoroughly depressing place and an ideal spot for a quiet murder with a perfect depository for unidentified bodies." Why did I have to finish up an otherwise cheerful letter on such an unpleasant note? Maybe I'll write a mystery story on that theme after I get home. Every bit of my love, always, always yours, Red. That's cute. Thursday, July 5th. My honey, baby, and mother. Tuesday I received both your letter 43 and Mother's containing the newspaper clippings about what outfits are returning to the States and when. It was somewhat of a thrill to get clippings from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The news may have been true, too, but like most everything the government or army put out now, it's very misleading in what it doesn't say. It was more of a thrill, as well as somehow I could look and believe, to get the 2 pictures of Barbara with you supporting her and the teddy bear in one. And besides, honey, you certainly didn't look like a spook to me in the picture, and you won't in real life when I get there. You may rest assured on that point. I've had another trip to Venice, even had my picture taken in front of the historic San Marco, St. Mark's Cathedral. The church is older than St. Peter's in Rome. Supposed to be something like 1,000 years old, and under it is supposed to be buried the remains of St. Mark. Who knows? Could be. At least that's where the church gets its name. He is also the patron saint of Venice. And don't try to tell anyone... Don't try to tell any Venetian that the British 8th, the American 5th, or anyone else but St. Mark was responsible for driving the Germans out of Venice and liberating the Venetians 2 months ago. In spite of all this, Venice is really a storybook city, the one above all others, which will hit someday on our world tour. Incidentally, the pictures, though not a particular good likeness of my mug, might help to relieve the shock of my eventual homecoming on Barbara, such as the little guy in the enclosed clipping is experiencing. Probably you saw the picture in the States. It deserves wide publicity, especially among those military and political fakers who are doing all they can do to continue keeping families separated as long as possible. But getting back to Venice, I picked up some interesting knickknacks from which I am sending under separate cover for my next stop. I am also enclosing a strip map of where I am going and how we get there. It will be a rough trip, but it's much the same route we traveled coming up here, and incidentally it winds up within about 20 miles of Naples, about 30 of Cassino, including some of the most shot-to-hell territory in Italy, especially below the Po River. But at least going back it won't be anything like as rough as it was coming up. We won't be carrying ack-ack and machine guns on top of the truck. We won't be taking turns with the guns, we won't be driving blackout, and we won't be constantly on our toes to get over the side and into a ditch. And we won't be walking or sneaking Indian fashion on foot any part of the way. It is also a rare coincidence that this trip winds up within about 20 miles of the bombed-out port across the sunken hulls of 3 preceding troop ships when I first set foot in really tragically unfortunate Italy. At this writing, what is going to happen to me? It looks something like this. I've already been on 3 transfer orders and have been scratched at the last moment as essential. Well, you know, the General knows, Truman knows, and I know that I am not. All the essential tag means is that some officer who never made more than $125 a month in his life before coming into the Army, by his own admission to me personally, and who is now serving his country at more than $500 and keep the officers is something including liquor, senoritas, signorinas, and all the trimmings might be somewhat embarrassed if one or more essential serial numbers didn't do his work right after the gangplank. However, I'm not sorry I've been scratched so far as one of the outfits is pulling occupation duty in Austria. One is scheduled for the Pacific Direct, and the other remains north of the Po, and may or may not get home by Christmas. Luck like that cannot hold on for long, and the best it holds only until all of the 85-point boys get on the boat, at which point I may, very likely will, wind up in a Ruppel-Druppel replacement depot from whence I come, unwept, unhonored, and unsung. From there on, it's anybody's guess. That's how I got to be the heavy weapons man in the first place last fall. Anyone who hasn't been in one doesn't know it, but a Ruppel-Druppel is a place into which you go with a certain spec number, which very roughly indicates what you are capable of doing, and out of which you come as anything but what your spec number indicates you are capable of doing. Maybe I'm painting this too black, I hope so. But as it happened to me once, I naturally feel it may happen again. I'm still telling myself that somehow, somewhere along the line, the Army will shuffle my number in such a way that I'll still get home for Christmas, maybe even Thanksgiving, but as my Guinea friends often ask, Dove andare via Pacifico? Roughly, how do you go on your way to the Pacific? Never loved you more, honey. Barbara and Mother, too. Always all yours, Red. This letter is dated August 13th, 1944. And this is some dark, cryptic thing, you know, about my family, my grandfather's alluding to. He's somewhere in Italy. And by the same mail, I received Grandma's letter written just a few days after you had returned from the hospital, in which she says you're looking much better than in the picture. So now I'm wondering what the Army has done with the picture. I'll probably get that with my discharge. How I wish they'd hold that re-election tomorrow. I see no good reason for FDR continuing to keep the world in alleged suspense until November 7th. Do you? From Grandma's letter and others I have received, I gather that you are holding Barbara's middle name open for me to fill in, but I'm still not quite clear as to whether you plugged the gap for birth registration purpose with an A, a V, or maybe just a plain and indefinite X, which reminds me of an X in the book February Hill. Remember? No, absolutely no sarcasm intended, so help me. But there will be plenty of time for us to worry about that after I get home. But in the interval, don't do anything to Barbara while she's still unable to defend herself, similar to what they did to Grandma and me in the way of queer names, and at a time when we were both too young to hit back. And going even farther back into the Mitchell family history, they did the same thing to my paternal grandfather and my dad. In grandfather's case, they omitted a middle name entirely, so in later life, he inserted an X himself just to keep his mail from falling into enemy hands. So they tell me. He must have been in the army too long, and it hadn't changed a bit in that respect. Then along came my old man at an extremely early age. According to the family legend, he had an aunt by the name of Addis, or letters to that effect. She probably had $50 or so and must have been in poor health, and they hung the first 3 letters of that name on him. If she'd had 100 and happened to be the actual dying at the time, they would probably have given the old man the entire handle to carry through life. But the abbreviated version was burden enough, and I don't think he ever got the $50 either. Then I came along, also very young and tender, and you know the rest. The old man passed it on to me like a hot potato. When I got the news, it was too late to do much about it, and I couldn't blame the old man either after carrying the load all those years. He naturally wanted to unload it, and he must have known that I was his last chance. Well, you know what I did with it. I couldn't return it to the manufacturers, so I did my best to disguise it and improve it. I know what you mean, Grandpa. A name like Susanna Bernadine Glasscock is tough. But in case all this sounds vague and confused to you, ask Burl. Being somewhat familiar with Mitchell family history, he should be able to throw some light on these skeletons in our family closet. But what I'm really getting at is it must not happen to Barbara. As soon as she gets old enough to know better, she disown it and us. And having done practically the same thing myself, I can't say that I'd blame her. I'm still partial to the name Hazel. That's my girlfriend's name, and I'm more partial than ever to it. My second choice would be just leave it open for the present. I've often thought, in fact I think I expressed the idea to you, that every kid is entitled to at least 1/3 of an opinion of her own as to the handle by which the world is going to push her around for the rest of her life. What do you think? That should be enough for now on the subject of what's in a name, although I seem to remember someone once wrote a complete book on that subject. From what you write, I gather that Barbara is growing and gaining weight in accordance with approved New Deal statistics on the subject of growing babies. I'll have to look up Mussolini's statistics on that subject the next time I get to town. I understand he went into it even more thoroughly than FDR's Brain Trust. If her diet works so satisfactorily on her, you might ask her to mail me the recipe and I could enclose it in my next letter to ... By the way, how is her mother's weight now? Have her write me, too. And incidentally, she hasn't yet answered my first letter. I do hope the trait is not hereditary, too. And who do you suppose sent me congratulations? John Brower from Bankers in Chicago. I can't imagine how he got the news, but from the date of his letter, he always scooped me on it. I just wrote him an acknowledgement, but gave you credit for the put-out, accepting only a very modest assist on the play myself. Now, honey, as you might guess, It's chow time, and there's something very special tonight. One of those very rare rations of American beer. Not cold, but at least a souvenir from the States. And speaking of souvenirs, I'm enclosing the stub of an admission ticket to the Dome of St. Peter's. I had quite an extended trip down that way last week, and of course I made the most of it. Among other places, I went through the catacombs this time. Delightfully spooky. Remind me to describe them to you some dark, stormy night with the lights out and order when I get back. Tell Burl to ignore that postscript. I've taken care of the matter myself, and incidentally, how's our little niece doing down on that southern trip she was contemplating in Burl's last letter? Something changes after this letter, and we flip to these things, which are pretty cool. There are 85th Division highlights on one side, and then my grandfather's letters home to her. So I'm assuming by that point his secretarial skills are gaining him a higher rank. I'm just going to read a couple excerpts from these. This is from September 22nd. But now for something more pleasant. I am no longer a rifleman on Army records. My CO has gotten a formal transfer through, and my spec number, which is the guide the Army uses in selecting fresh meat, has been changed to that of a clerk in info ed. The transfer may have been just a necessary formality, but nevertheless it is a welcome relief to me. October 3rd, 1944, somewhere else in Italy. One of these days after November 7th, they are going to quit fighting in Europe, but the Battle of Washington as to what to do about deported GIs will probably go on until the next World War, and that is literally possible. That gives the politicos and the dollar of the year men, who are averaging closer to $1 a minute in war profits, a new mark to shoot at. Up to now, I've thought they probably planned to let it end in Europe this fall and in the Pacific next spring. Now I'm beginning to feel that they've officially advanced the date to mid-1945 for Europe and about a year later for Japan. I'm personally in favor of doubling their take from now on out, so as to end the war that much sooner without damage to their sensitive pocketbooks, with some conservation of blood and nerves over here. Maybe I didn't mention it in my last letter, but I'm in info ed work here now. Indications are at this early date that the government's program along those lines is going to be quite extensive and long range. The work is pleasant and very interesting and promises to become moroso. October 17th. The mails are still slow, and with the Christmas load ahead, they'll probably get slower before they improve. By the time you get this, FDR may have been re-elected. I hope so for several reasons. I've quit reading, and I've tried to even quit thinking about demobilization. It seems to be so far distant. You haven't written word recently about Don and Charlie. No doubt Charlie is still in the Pacific, and I'm wondering if Don isn't somewhere out there, way too by this time. Neither have you written about how much you like the Red Bud address. From what you write, I don't suppose it is quite as nice as where we were used to on Marshall Field's Gardens, but from that address I judge it is not too bad either. Neither you have written much about Barbara or Grandma or Hazel either, or maybe your mail hasn't just been coming through to me. You probably remember Joe Plushy at Camp Fannin, the guy who wanted you to select a Valentine for his girlfriend and then wound up buying her a bulletproof prayer book. He is having difficulties over here similar to those he had in the States. Young Cerno, the boxer from Chicago, will never have any more difficulties of any kind. Young Dickie O'Connor, the kid who went all the way from induction center to Italy with me, has had medical attention several times, but is back in the lines just now. Mel Schillen and I have been luckiest by the old bunch by far. Honey, that's all the gossip for now. I'm not writing my usual monthly anniversary message to Barbara, so long as they make you so sad. But say howdy to her and Grandma, and don't worry about me. October 24th. We get plenty of news from the fighting fronts, some of it very direct from the feedback, but not a word from St. Louis. I've been sitting up nights listening to Berlin and Moscow, hoping to hear something from the Mississippi sector, but they are quite close-mouthed on that subject too. Berlin did deny that they were losing the World Series. In fact, they do that every night. But since Stalin fired a 24-gun salvo for the Cardinals, not even a word about street fighting in Biddle Market. It must still be going on there. And who's ahead in that tussle between you and Barbara? Are you holding your own with her, or do you still have to hold her until she falls asleep and can't fight back? And how are you and Grandma coming out of the diaper department? I'll bet that portable Sears and Roebuck washer is taking a terrific beating. Now here comes a serious request. Remember that letter I received from the University of Illinois several years ago regarding entrance credits? As I remember, you had in your valuable documents and diplomatic secrets file for a long time. If you can still find it, please have a photostatic copy made and mail it quickly to me. I may be able to pick up a college credit or two in my spare time over here. Do not misunderstand. If I do enroll in the Armed Forces Institute for a subject or two, it will not in any way delay my homecoming. In fact, the courses are arranged so that should a man become eligible for deportation to the States, such enrollment will not interfere. So send a copy if possible, but don't run downtown this minute to have a copy made, even if you can find the original letter. I'm enclosing the war news. Give me the scoop from the home front. Sunday, November 5th. Still somewhere in Italy. My honey, here comes your personal newsletter. In Italy, everything's under control, just a matter of time. On the home front, I'm not so confident. The situation's somewhat obscure. That line about the home front is probably in need of clarification. By that I mean that your last letter or two have been a bit concerned, that you're worrying about things that will never come to pass. Honey, dismiss from your mind right now any ideas that in the years to come I won't have just as much real love for Barbara, just as much appreciated for her, and just as much realization that she is our own. And if I had been walking the floor to Paul when she arrived, it couldn't be helped that I wasn't there. It's undoubtedly the most important event in our lives that I have missed, and one that I will have to try for the rest of my life, after I do get home, to make up for. November 7th. In your last letter you mentioned an appointment with Belle about going to work. Aren't you a bit hasty in that? From reading between the lines of you and Grandma's letters, I gather that you haven't really come back completely from Barbara's arrival. I know it's discomforting for you to see the bank account constantly diminishing, but your health and Barbara's in future years are more important than a few bucks in the bank. Then, too, I gather that you and Grandma have had your hands full with the moving to the new address. Hadn't you both better sort of rest up and relax, at least until after the first of the year? Then, too, now that I am a man of rank, I'm definitely pulling through that $20 monthly increase in your allotment. I didn't put it through when I first wrote you about it a couple months ago, as I bought a wristwatch, a pen and pencil set, those jewelry gadgets, and some knitted items for you three, and maybe a cap or two for the Bauer girls, which are now on their way to you. All my love, Red. November 12th, somewhere in Italy. During the past week, I received 2 more of your September letters. You had written them just after you moved into Edna's place on Redbud. I do hope you find the place homier now than you did when you were still somewhat torn up with the moving. It was both good and bad news to hear that no place you will ever seem like home without me. Of course, I always knew you felt that way, and I've never felt more that way myself than I do right now. But right now, and for some time to come, it looks like Barbara and Grandma are going to have to continue pinch hitting for me and rounding out the family circle. Just now, we are bivouacked quite close to one of those quaint towns so numerous in this part of Italy. It is a very interesting mixture of the modern and the ancient. It contains a few buildings as modern as one would expect to find in a progressive small town in the States. Yet it has bits of medieval wall and built-in clock towers, watchtowers, built-in defense apertures, etc. It also has its ancient dwelling, centuries older than its oldest inhabitants. Its main street is as narrow an ordinary alley back home, but nothing like that straight. In fact, except for about 1 block stretch in the very center of town, as crooked as a pretzel. It's one of those few towns which was just off the beaten path of the war, as the Germans withdrew through this particular sector, and consequently the customary demolitions are conspicuous by their absence. Maybe that's another reason the town impressed me differently than many we've been through, which not long ago must have looked very much as this one does now. It's tucked away in the mountain in such a way that if it ever escaped the heavy artillery, only in rail connections were destroyed. Not many soldiers had preceded us through the town, so when we came through, we must have been almost as much of a curiosity to the natives as they once would have been to us. Soldiers get a much different type of reception in a town that hasn't already been overrun by soldiers. But one thing they have in common with practically all Italian natives that I've met yet, they have their hand out constantly for cigarettes, caramel, chocolate, and pana, which means bread, and mangiare, literally to eat, actually mean give me anything edible. Even in this small town where the people are comparatively well off, where they have been as little touched by the war as any people possibly in Italy, where they all keep a few chickens running around underfoot in the house along with the bambinos, and occasionally an anemic pig or two, and with pigeons roosting on the chandeliers, the food problem is really acute. And how these Italians love a band, though most of them are better musicians than our GI drum beats and horn blowers. Yesterday, our own outfit's band held a slightly ridiculous Armistice Day workout. It wouldn't have drawn any attention from any of us GIs who didn't have to participate if it hadn't been for the small army of ragged Italians from 6 months to 60 years who appeared from nowhere and everywhere, and all at once to take in the show. Every Italian within hearing, and I mean everyone from 6 months to 60 years, turned out for it. And without any conscious effort, in fact. They weren't even conscious of how it all appeared to us. They put on a much better show than the band. They marched up and down the main street, before, behind, on both sides of it, and particularly on top of the band. Every little kid and old man along them was a director without a baton. But they didn't need one. Without meaning it in a derogatory sense, They looked like the Pied Piper of Hamelin must have looked when he led the rats out of that town in the fairy tale I read when I was a kid. They're to band music what Negroes are to boogie woogie. You get what I mean? It's just in them that they have to let it out. Something like a drunken GI in their open-air sidewalk latrines, if you get what I'm driving at. That's all for now, honey. I'm running out of time, light, and paper. November 17th. Just a letter that song on the radio from the States about, I wish I could hide inside this letter. So even though that's out of the question, I thought it would be a good time to write anyway. We still get our best news from London and Berlin, but they can't tie U.S. broadcasts for rose-colored rumors. Just heard on to the effect that peace talks were already scheduled for Lisbon, Portugal. Lisbon, being one of the few neutral capitals in the world, is a logical place for peace talks, and despite the unconditional surrender propaganda, they do have to get together across the table sometime, somewhere. Yesterday, I chalked up another first in Italy experience. I sat in a real American barber chair and had my hair cut by a barber with electric clippers. Most of my haircuts over here have been by another GI who has picked up a little barbering experience while sitting on an ammo box, or else by an itinerary guinea who knew more about the barber of Seville than about barbering. Speaking of barbering, reminds me, what is that barber doing these days? You haven't written me about her and ages, it seems. Which in turn reminds me of the little guineas over here. The band had another workout today and the kids repeated the same routine I wrote you about. Here's the last one, 1944. Still in Italy. Don doesn't know how lucky he was to get home once again, even for a brief period. I'd hesitate momentarily at least about my right arm, but I think I could be talked into giving my left arm to get back myself, and that goes literally. But why talk about such foolishment, as Florian Slappy used to say? From what you write about Barbara, I certainly am missing some of the best days of my life in this mud hole known as sunny Italy to millions who have never been here. If it were mine, I'd trade the whole damn country for East St. Louis, and I used to consider that the subrectum of creation. Why anybody ever seriously thought of fighting for it beats the hell out of me, as one of my hillbilly buddies once so aptly expressed the thought. Of course, that doesn't go literally. I do think I understand why they fight for Italy, but it really isn't for Italy at all, if that makes any sense. But if it doesn't make any sense to you, you've got a lot in common with a lot of GIs who are struggling it out within a precious, very few precious miles from my CP. I won't ask you to enjoy Thanksgiving Day. I didn't either. I had every reason to enjoy it, though. Again, speaking comparatively, I helped cover a ceremony where a couple of generals, a bit lesser brass, and tons of tin were giving and receiving assorted decorations. I had a turkey dinner with all the trimmings, but only a mess kit in the rain. I just couldn't get in the spirit. All this took place at some distance, quite a safe distance in fact, from the scene of hostilities, as the safe and very sane columnist liked to express it. The town must really have been something in Benito's heyday. A resort town. Reminds me very much of Excelsior Springs, Missouri. It was once a spot for big-shot fascists, later a German high command HQ, now a rest camp for broken-down GIs. And I don't read any unintended meaning into that. I was never further from being broken down physically myself. I just wish I could unload some of my AVOIRDUPOIS. Let's just say his charm on you right now. I'm no Burl Mitchell yet, but I can cast a very substantial shadow for my length. I don't really know how much I weigh. Penny scales or something someone doesn't find on street corners over here. It's still tough enough to find a street corner, but I'm just as healthy as you thought I looked in that Rose photo. But let's get back to Grandma's problem, Barbara. It would really be a treat to see that first tooth and to see her struggle to step up. I really didn't know how things happened so early in life. But there I go again, mentally trying to compare Barbara with an ordinary Bambini. War news has really warmed up again, hasn't it? And this time I really believe the European kettle is about to blow her lid. I said it before, didn't I? But like Hitler and Winchell, if I repeat it often enough, I'm bound to be right, eventually. Seriously though, I think Europe has a good chance for a happy Christmas. That news comes from China and is really ominous. That's one thing I like about the delaying action in Italy. Every day I spend here is one more day they can never make me spend in the Pacific. They don't go worrying about that at an early date. Odds are very much against my participation. Honey, I love you so much. So long for now. This concludes 1944.